welcome back to my channel. I am the Woodland Witch, and today we are talking about folk magic. This is going to be in the eyes of a Celtic folk witch and modern practitioner, but this is going to be information that you can utilize in any sort of folk practice that you're looking to get into. Now this video is going to be a little bittersweet. As you all know, my family and I are moving to New England, and while we're very excited, it is a little sad. We built a family in this home. It is going to be my last video in this home, and I've connected with so much of you living here, and it's just a huge chapter to be moving on from. And while we're really excited, it's also a little sad to leave. But overall, we're really excited, and I think it's going to be an amazing chapter for us. Also, I'm going to be living an hour outside of Salem, Massachusetts, so I think I'm going to find my people. So folk magic is kind of an umbrella term for any kind of magic that was worked on by the common folk of a specific area or a specific region or specific culture. The practices are going to vary region to region, culture to culture, and that's an important thing to remember. Now, the first thing I did when getting into folk magic was ancestry. That's just how I specifically did it. You don't necessarily have to do that. My practice specifically focuses on Celtic folk traditions, and that is where a lot of my ancestors and my family are from. So that is where most of my folk traditions come from. Now, I will say it is not necessary to be a part of a specific ancestry to incorporate specific folk traditions into your practice, but I will say to be wary. There are a lot of traditions that are specific to specific cultures, so just be aware of what you're doing, do your research, and be respectful. So as I said, a primary focus of my practice is Celtic folk traditions. Now, how did I get into folk magic? This book right here. This book changed my practice completely, like 100%. A lot of you saw me unbox this on my TikTok probably about like 8 months ago. It is the only gift I have ever received on my Amazon wish list, and it was the best gift, and it completely shifted my practice 100%. I started reading this in the hospital after I had my baby, and a lot of you know how traumatic my birth was, and this was kind of like my saving grace. I guess you could say this was a way for me to get my mind off of everything. And this book is called Wild Magic: Celtic Folk Traditions for the Solitary Practitioner. Thank you, Lauren. Lauren got me this book. So when I started reading this book, I knew that I was Scottish, I knew that I was Irish, I knew I had a lot of Celtic blood, and it kind of drew me to look into my ancestry a little bit more. Now, like I said before, you don't have to be of a specific ancestry, but for me personally, I went and I started building an ancestry tree. Ancestry.com has a free trial. I think it's 30 days. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 30 days. And you can build an entire tree. I spent days, nights building this tree. And while I hit some dead ends, I was able to, still track a lot of my lineage into the specific places. Another thing that I did was look at surnames. So I had McLaughlin, which, Mick is a very big thing in Celtic names, specifically Scottish and Irish. It was a way to keep on the name and to represent your family. So Mick or Mac meant son of, and then you have names such as O'Leary that would signify grandson of. So I had a few Micks, MCs, that I could see on my father's side, and so I looked into those surnames. I started Googling them. I traced them back to specific regions in Ireland and in Scotland or England. I was able to trace my family back to these specific spots. And for me, ancestry is a huge part of my practice. I feel like the reason I was drawn to witchcraft and folk magic in general is because of my ancestors and because of my lineage. So for me specifically, that's a really big part of it. Now, when I got into this family tree and I was continuing to read this book, I've said this before, and it felt like I was coming home. I felt like I was coming home, and I felt like my practice finally found its place. I found my path. I found where I was supposed to be. One of the things that is talked about in this book that I really resonated with was Animism, and that is the belief that everything has a spirit. It's something I incorporated into my practice a lot. Another thing that is involved is bioregionalism, which is kind of looking at the plants, the space, the world around your specific area and utilizing it in your everyday practice. So if you're looking at the Sabbats or, the solstices, which were more commonly focused on back in the day, you have the winter solstice, the summer solstice. In different areas, those are going to show up differently for you. So when it comes to bioregionalism, it's incorporating these seasons as they come and as they are happening in real time, as opposed to specific dates. So that's just one of the ways in folk magic that you incorporate bioregionalism and paying attention to the world around you at a specific time. And as far as animism goes, this book does a really good job of connecting with air spirits, fire spirits, water spirits. And that's all stuff that you will see heavily, heavily talked about in folklore. And if you're interested in folk practices in general, I highly recommend this book. I've seen a lot of these things done universally across different folk magic practices, just maybe a little bit differently and varying from region to region. So when getting into folk magic, there was a lot of, I want to say, religious trauma that I kind of had to heal. A lot of these folk traditions are heavily influenced by Christianity and Catholicism. So from my perspective, being raised like heavily Christian, when I started practicing witchcraft, I was like, nope, no. I want nothing to do with Christianity. I want nothing to do with the Christian God. I want nothing to do with the saints. I want nothing to do with any of that. Archangels, anything. And my ancestors were like, okay, bet. It's important to note that a lot of these practices are heavily rooted in Christianity and Catholicism. And with that, there needs to be a lot of respect. When it comes to these specific traditions, obviously, I don't work with the Christian God. I don't plan really to working with the Christian God. I attempted that many, many times before, and it just seems to be a mutual thing. That doesn't mean that I can just completely ignore that fact of the folk practices that I incorporate into my witchcraft practice. Now, the reason a lot of these practices are heavily rooted in Christianity and Catholicism is because folk magic was thought of as a different thing than witchcraft. Witch was not a nice term. Witch was a very bad thing back in the day. And if you're practicing folk magic, it's important to know that if your ancestors practiced folk magic, they probably thought witchcraft was terrible. They probably thought it was blasphemous, and they were actively working against witchcraft. Now, witches at the time were defined as evil. They practiced baneful magic. They were doing things that were harmful to the community. When it comes to folk magic, a lot of these common folk practices were done to counteract witchcraft or for the benefit of the community. So that made it okay in the eyes of the Christian church. And that kind of got to a point where people were like, you can't really fight witchcraft with witchcraft. And it varied over the years. It would be okay 1 minute, and then 5 years later, it wasn't okay what you were doing. And there were specific things they were kind of iffy about. If it was too witchy, they would question you, and you would be tried just the same. Now, my practice specifically focusing on Celtic folk traditions, there is evidence of old religion, what was considered paganism, Gaelic polytheism, and while there were specific traditions that were kept from that time, there's not a whole lot of evidence of it. And it's important to note that a lot of the traditions that occurred through that Christian and Catholic revolution, these were the common practices. And a lot of these practices and rituals were done calling on the Virgin Mary or calling on the 12 apostles or the Holy Trinity, archangels. And it's something to be respectful of. I definitely had to heal a lot of religious trauma doing that. I, like I said, wanted absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, and that has shifted 100%. It's okay to tweak and modernize things a little bit, but I really try to avoid changing as much as I possibly can. And that is mainly because a lot of these cultures, a lot of these old religions, they are dying. These practices, these things that are passed down from family to family are dying out, especially in the focus of Celtic folk magic. If you're interested in a mini documentary, it's called When the Song Dies, and it is, I think, 5 or 6 individuals from Scotland who are just speaking of the traditions that they had in their family, the superstitions, the little things that were passed down from generation to generation that are just dying. So it's important to keep these traditions as unchanged as you possibly can. With that being said, it is okay to tweak a few things here and there. Now, for instance, if something calls on the Holy Trinity, I will replace that with An Tri Nef, which means the sacred three in Scots Gaelic, and that stands for ancestors, gods, and spirits. Now that could be An Tri Neom. It just depends on what dialect you're speaking, but for me, that is my sacred three. Now, like I said, I'm not going to take a specific incantation that is directed towards a specific deity or a specific spirit and give it to someone else. such as the Virgin Mary and giving an incantation to Alma Digna. I try to keep these traditions as untouched as I possibly can. If there's something that is out of my comfort zone or a little too Christian, maybe I won't incorporate that into my practice, but I try to leave that as unchanged as I possibly can. Another thing about folk traditions is there's going to be some that you find a lot of information on, and there's going to be some that you find none on. There are a few things that I've utilized and a few resources I've used to kind of get the information that I need. But a lot of these traditions were given verbally. So the people who practiced folk magic were considered cunning folk. They weren't witches. Like I said before, witchcraft was very looked at negatively. And a lot of it was for just common people. Cunning folk were considered common folk. And a lot of them were illiterate. And a lot of these traditions were passed down verbally. And a lot of these practices, these rituals, these incantations were just done verbally. They didn't have a lot of tools. They used what little things that they had. And a lot of their magic was done by mouth. So when it comes to looking for specific things or specific charms and incantations, sometimes it can get a little hard. Some of the things that I've done have been to look at universities. So for instance, you have the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft from the University of Edinburgh. Tons of resources for accused witches. You can look up specific things by trial, little details about the trial by name. And a lot of universities actually have this resource, especially in specific areas. You can find this information. You can listen to podcasts. If you know Temperance Alden, they have a podcast called Folkcraft, and that is an amazing resource for getting into folk magic. They incorporate animism and bioregionalism into their practice, which is amazing. And that podcast actually led me to another resource on YouTube, which was a video of Diane Purkis, who was doing some kind of a seminar and was speaking in front of like a college class. And it was called Scottish Witches, Fairies, and Old Religion. You can find a lot of information on things like that when it comes to universities and college classes. People are doing seminars. Check blog posts as well. One folk magic blog that I really enjoy is Kaliak's Herbiary. If you're looking for a folk practice resource that does not really incorporate witchcraft at all, but is just kind of an overall look at the practices on their own, I think that's a fantastic resource. And there's always books. So I have a few books that I'm going to recommend here. So some of these books I've read, some of them I haven't. I intended to do a book haul video, but it just kind of didn't happen with things being so hectic and moving. But this is kind of going to be a little bit of a wider variety. So I'm going to talk mostly about what I liked about the ones that I did read and kind of share with you the other books that I've heard great things about that I am going to recommend to you as well. So obviously I talked about this earlier in the video. Wild Magic, Celtic Folk Traditions for the Solitary Practitioner. This book has changed my life. It changed my practice completely, and I will say it again, and I will read it again. Get this book. Another really great folk witchcraft book was Folk Witchcraft, A Guide to Lore and the Familiar Spirit for the Solitary Practitioner by Roger J. Horn. I think this book does a really good job of connecting folk magic with witchcraft, because obviously we discussed earlier they aren't the same thing. Witchcraft is very looked down upon, and folk magic was kind of a way for the the cunning folk were practicing witchcraft. It is what it is. But they were doing good for the community, so it was considered acceptable by the Christian church or Catholic church, which is, it is what it is. But this book does a really good job of going into connecting with the land. There's a bunch of incantations, charms, rituals in here to incorporate. And the author even says, make it your own, change it how you want. These are his specific incantations and charms, but I think it's really awesome for them to share it with you and to be able to kind of work it into your practice however it fits in. Another thing I really like about this book is the resources that are given. There's quite a few extensive reading material in here that you can follow up with. And this book is going to connect me with the next book I'm going to talk to you about, and that is The Crooked Path. This book is an introduction to traditional witchcraft. Now, traditional witchcraft and folk magic are not the same thing, but this is a path that is heavily rooted in folklore. It does a really, really good job of tying in folk magic with modern witchcraft practices. You'll see a lot of similar things in both of these books. They're just kind of done differently, or there's different terminology used. For instance, in this book, casting a circle is called to lay the ring. In here, it is called laying the compass round, things like that. And you'll see a lot of similarities, especially with tools such as the stang, the besom. But I really like this book because there are parts in it that have really benefited my practice, such as hollowing tools and things like that. It goes into the difference between traditional witchcraft and Wicca, and how certain modern witches such as Robert Cochrane or Doreen Valiente kind of influenced witchcraft and influenced the formation of traditional witchcraft. Another reason I really like this book is there are sections in here called From the Spirits of Lore, and it's just little backstories and folklore stories of where a specific ritual was inspired from, a specific tool, and things like that. So I think this is a really resourceful book if you're looking to combine folk magic and witchcraft into a modern practice. Now, this book is going to be specific to my practice. It doesn't have to be for yours, but this is Folklore in Lowland Scotland. It doesn't really specifically matter. The title doesn't really specifically matter, but I heavily suggest looking into a specific region of folk magic and folklore. Folklore in Lowland Scotland and the folklore in Highland Scotland are going to be very different. So I highly recommend getting books on different regions. Whether you're in Ireland, you're studying folklore in England or North American folk magic, highly suggest that you get books that are regionalized to a specific area. This next book I have not read. I've heard wonderful things about it. It is called Backwoods Witchcraft, Conjure and Folk Magic from Appalachia. Branching out my folk magic studies, I've primarily spent the last 6 months studying Celtic folk practices, and I kind of wanted to branch out a little bit. While I don't see myself practicing Appalachian folk magic, I think growing up in the Appalachians and living in the Appalachians, it would be very interesting to read and know about, and if this is something you're interested in, I did hear very wonderful things about this book. Now, the last but not least, final book that I have to share was actually my anniversary present. My husband and I just celebrated our 8-year anniversary, and that is New World Witchery, and this is a trove of North American folk magic. I am not even a quarter through this book yet, but there is so much information in here. So this book is Folk Magic Hidden in Plain Sight, exploring nearly 500 samples of stories, artifacts, rituals, and beliefs. Hutchinson has crafted a definitive yet accessible book exploring the history and practices of North American witchcraft and magic. What I really like about this book so far that I've seen is it goes into there's a lot of correspondences in here. Like, there's a lot of correspondences. And I live in North America, so I'm very excited to get into this. I think it's going to be really beneficial. It seems like there's a lot of information in here. Like I said, I'm not even a quarter of the way through it. There's so much. There's tons of correspondences, just little charms, different things you can do, associations, like so much stuff in here. And like I said, I've been focusing mostly on Celtic folk practices over the last 6 months since I started my folk magic journey, and it's going to be really nice to get a little closer to home and find some new practices to incorporate into my modern day. And that is today's video on folk magic. It was kind of just an intro video. Obviously, I am still learning every day. There's so much that goes into it, and that's the beauty of witchcraft in general, is that the process is never ending. We are always growing and we're always learning new things. The next time you see me, I will be in my home in New England, and I look forward to seeing you all then.